Good evening. Good evening and welcome to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and our program, Universities on the Leading Edge, Advancing Dialogue on Bioethics. I'm Kathy Kinlaw. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Ethics at Emory University, where I lead our programming in biomedical ethics. As a graduate of both Emory College and Candler School of Theology, I want to offer a special welcome to all of the alumni in the audience, both of Emory University and University of Pennsylvania. And I thank all of you for joining us tonight. We're very fortunate to be gathering in this beautiful facility, so I'd like to offer a special thanks to CDC for hosting us here tonight. Our topic tonight, Advancing the Dialogue on Bioethics, invites faculty scholars, our universities, the public, the research industry, and national bodies like the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues to a complex discussion. At stake is what it means to be ethically responsible in research, in healthcare, and in attending to emerging technologies. Bioethics as a field has both ancient roots, we think Socrates and Aristotle, and a modern history rooted in the protection of human subjects post-World War II, extending into the clinical care of particular patients, and more recently, deepening work in the realm of public health ethics. The broad scope and evolving nature of bioethics is reflected in the work of prior national bioethics commissions and advisory councils reaching back to 1974, and as we'll learn more about tonight, the current commission that was established in 2009. In just a moment, Presidents Gutman and Wagner will make opening statements. Following those statements, my fellow moderator, Jonathan Marino, will begin our conversation. But first, I have the pleasure of formally introducing our speakers. So joining me as moderator is my colleague, Dr. Jonathan Marino, the David and Lynn Silfen University Professor of Ethics, Professor of Medical Ethics, and Professor of History and Sociology of Science at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Marino is a well-known scholar in bioethics, editor of the journal Science Progress, an elected member of the Institutes of Medicine, and has served on numerous bioethics boards and committees. His most recent book, published this year, is the anthology Progress in Bioethics, Science, Policy, and Politics. Please welcome Dr. Jonathan Marino. The chair of the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues is a political scientist and philosopher who's authored and edited 15 books, has published more than 100 articles, essays, and book chapters, and continues to teach and write on ethics and public policy, democracy, and education. As president of the University of Pennsylvania since 2004, she's united students, faculty, alumni, and friends around the Penn Compact, a strategic vision that aims to propel Penn from excellence to eminence by increasing access and connecting excellence and opportunity, integrating knowledge through interdisciplinary teaching and research, and engaging locally and globally. Please welcome the President of University of Pennsylvania and Chair of the Presidential Commission, Amy Gutman. And our first speaker tonight is the president of Emory University, who joined Emory as its 19th president in 2003. He is an engineer devoted to the mission of liberal education, who prior to coming to Atlanta held distinguished faculty positions at Johns Hopkins and served as provost and interim president at Case Western. He's the author of more than 115 publications, and early in his tenure at Emory, he created a campus-wide initiative to develop a clear vision statement for the university, and it places ethical engagement as a foundational pillar. Please welcome, as our first speaker, the President of Emory University and Vice Chair of the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues, Jim Wagner.
Kathy, thank you for that introduction. Welcome to everyone. Welcome to Emory alums. Welcome to Penn alums. Welcome to faculty and staff that I've seen here, students, friends and neighbors. Welcome to those that are members of the CDC. In fact, special thanks to the CDC for making this venue available to us this evening. Extra special thanks, Amy, to you. We're fortunate to have kept her in Atlanta for a couple of days, where she's been leading the President's Commission on the Study of Bioethical Issues, and it's been my pleasure to be able to support her leadership as Vice Chair and to work with that amazing group of people. It's been a wonderful couple of days, and that she would hang on a little extra to do this. Special thanks to you. You know, our conversation this evening is on bioethics. I'd like to make a brief observation about ethics more broadly and the role of our universities. It seems, you may not know this, but there was actually a negative reaction from some quarters about the notion that two university presidents, research university presidents, would chair this particular commission on bioethics. You know, instead of some scholars like Jonathan or Kathy that are here, they just picked on a couple of presidents of universities. As you just heard, Amy's appointment makes sense. Dr. Gutman's appointment makes sense. She's a political theorist. She has worked also connecting political philosophy and policy. She is probably the world's most articulate champion of deliberative democracy. All of these things seem to play exactly into, provide the kind of tools one would need to lead a study on ethics. I'm afraid you can't find any of that in my resume. So it must be about Emory to some degree. As Kathy mentioned, we are an institution that has been explicit in our guiding documents, our vision and mission and strategy, explicit about what it means to aspire to be increasingly ethically engaged as we pursue advances in the frontiers of science and technology. We are a faculty and a community that is unusual among research universities in particular, for the facility that we have with a vocabulary of values. This may go back to Emory's Methodist roots and our continuing affiliation with the Methodist Church, but I can tell you it is practiced and advanced by a very highly visible and active ethics center. Now, having made the point that Emory and the Penn leadership and Penn do in fact find that ethics fits on our campus, you must understand that's also juxtaposed to people like Stanley Fish, who write emphatically that the university should get back to the basics of knowledge, teaching, creating, preserving knowledge, that our students should, and I'll quote from the title of his recent book, "Save the world on your own time." But I suggest to you that there is a role for university, that there is a new thirst for ethical practice, and that universities should be at the core of satisfying that thirst. It was only about 3 weeks ago, His Holiness the Dalai Lama was on campus for a few days, and on one of his public events, he spoke with some concern about the great accomplishment of the Western University in training the mind, and how he felt that training the mind alone was in fact dangerous if not accompanied by some form of moral preparation. The example that he used, of course, I shouldn't say of course, the example that he used was that of the great advances in nuclear chemistry that were applied first in the West to weaponry. I don't think he had to go that far back to find that great intelligence decoupled from moral guidance is potentially dangerous. He could have gone to the Enron debacle. He could have gone to some of the financial leadership that may have contributed or did contribute to the difficulties of the day. I mean, after all, we understand that with respect to Enron, it was about the smartest people in the room, and making them smarter was not necessarily going to avert what had happened there. So it makes sense, it seems to me, to be coupling excellence of the mind with greatness of heart. Our universities are places that perform research, they provide health care, we educate tomorrow's scholars and teachers and artists and lawyers and business leaders, physicians and politicians. But we need those scholars now more than ever to be of a different ilk. We need them, for example, to tell us what history means, not just what occurred, and what we can learn from the moral dimensions of that to advise us for our future. We need physicians and public health professionals whose passion is to heal people, not just to cure disease. We need lawyers who understand that their role goes beyond arguing the rules and loopholes, but is focused at least as much in building and maintaining what has been called the thin veneer of civilization. We need captains of business whose talent and passion for wealth creation is motivated at least as much by a commitment to society as it is for personal gain. And we need politicians. Oh, we need politicians with wisdom, with wisdom and moral courage to provide for us what it is we need, not merely the street smarts of appeasement that work only to get them reelected by pandering to our notions of what we think we want. We need people who feel confident. We want to feel confident in our abilities to exercise judgment based on ethics, our ability to make decisions based on moral principle. And I suggest to you, in fact, I insist, that our colleges and universities may be almost exclusively the intellectual breeding ground to produce people and ideas to meet these vital and timeless needs of society. So, it is right for us to be here this evening under the auspices of our connections with great research universities to discuss bioethics. Thank you for being here.
Well, it is my pleasure to be at Emory University in Atlanta, where it's a lot warmer than it is in Philadelphia. But that it's not only warmer in the climate here, weather-wise. It is warm because this, for me, is a first in my presidency to do an alumni event that combines the red and the blue with the blue and the gold. And those colors go together very well. So first and foremost, I must welcome the red and the blue among us, and also the blue and the gold. They're a great combination. So thank you all for having me here. It's really wonderful. So Jim Wagner, before he agreed to be vice chair of the commission, he wanted to make sure there was a chair he could work with. And I knew when I was told that Jim would be vice chair that I would have a great compliment. Jim, as you all know, who are at Emory, and now everybody at Penn knows, is an engineer with a head and a heart. And combining the theoretical and practical is something that's not only very, very important in engineering, but it's also important in every field. And one of the reasons Jim and I are inspired and energized by working together on the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues is that it's really important to bring the theoretical together with the practical in our universities, but also outside of our universities. And it is wonderful to see how this is happening on the President's Commission. So let me just tell you a story. As I was coming down, flying down here for the commission meetings, I was reminded, as I often am, of a story that my mother told me years ago, and you'll see how old this story is in a moment. But mothers and fathers teach you ethics before anybody else does. And this is a story about 4 people on an airplane, and the airplane is about to crash. And there are only 3 parachutes on the airplane. You'll see the purpose of the story in a moment. It's about the importance of knowing not only theoretical knowledge, but also practical knowledge. The 4 people are the President of the United States, the smartest philosopher in the world, a parish priest, and a hippie. Now you know how old the story is. So, 4 people on an airplane, 3 parachutes, it's about to crash. The President of the United States gets up, he takes one of the parachutes, and he says to his 3 colleagues, I'm the leader of the free world depends on me, the world depends on me for the leadership. He takes one of the parachutes and he jumps. Smartest philosopher in the world stands up and says, I'm the smartest philosopher in the world depends on me for knowledge, and he takes one and he jumps. At that point, the parish priest turns to the hippie and says, I have spent my whole life doing what is right. Please, son, take the last parachute and jump. To which, without missing a beat, the hippie looks at the parish priest and he says, don't worry, Pop, the smartest philosopher in the world just took my knapsack and jumped out of the airplane. That's the importance of practical knowledge, folks. And the parish priest tells why you always have to think about doing the right thing. So we are gathered as a President's Commission to deliberate about some of the toughest issues and most interesting and exciting issues as well about emerging science, technology, and medicine. Our 2 universities have some of the smartest and also wisest minds. Both of our universities have eminent ethics centers that really see as their mission bringing theory and practice together. I, as Jim has told you, have spent a fair amount of time not only talking about but practicing deliberation. Now, what is deliberation? Deliberation is very simple. It's a long word for simple and common, but not common enough practice, which is sitting down with people who don't necessarily agree with one another, sharing perspectives on practical issues and seeing if one can reach a well-reasoned consensus to move forward, and if one cannot, establishing a groundwork of respect, of mutual respect, that will enable one to move forward amidst disagreement. There is never been a time when democratic deliberation has been more important. And we see it in microcosm when big controversial issues hit the stage and we hear phrases like playing God, creating life, death panels, pulling the plug on grandma. You can, expand on these. And they do less to edify than they do to make people fearful. Everybody today who's here recognizes the importance of universities to furthering the disposition and the ability to deliberate among people who disagree. And that's something that brings Jim and myself together, engineer and political philosopher, differences aside. I began as a math major. So I've been in the land of science and math and really appreciate its strengths. But that brings us together. It brings us all here to talk about bioethics, and without further ado, I just want to thank all of you for joining us for this session and turn it over to our moderators. And I have to say, go Quakers, go Eagles. Thank you. Bye-bye.
So I want to add my words of gratitude also for the Penn folks to Emory. Jim, you not only have a great university, but a beautiful campus, and you got the perfect day to wander around today, which I did. And I want to be clear, for the record, I am not leaving that hotel at the conference center for the next 6 months.
It's a pleasant
You'll
place.
have a police incident. You try to get me out. I'm more relaxed than I've been in 2 weeks. So I'm going to remember that. You heard it here. So I'm a little concerned. I think we're missing the basketball game at 8 o'clock. So there will be buses outside afterwards for everybody to go to cheer on the Eagles. So let's get started with the basics. You are the chair and co-chair of a bioethics commission. Pretty sexy word, bioethics. Hear it a lot these days. What does it mean?
Good question. So bioethics is a subset of what I call practical ethics. Ethics goes back as far as recorded human history. There have been a concern about what people should do in their lives, and I would call that individual ethics, and what institutions should do to encourage people to live good lives. I call that institutional ethics. Bioethics has been an enormously rapidly growing field in the last 30 years, in the last 3 decades, because it has been the case that the expansion of science, technology, and medicine have called into question how doctors should treat their patients, what kinds of hospital practices there should be, what are the benefits and the risks of emerging technologies such as synthetic biology most recently, but neuroscience, nanotechnology, genetic engineering. Bioethics spans that whole range of questions about the distribution of resources, the treatment of individual vulnerable people, and also the best use of new emerging technologies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree. It's one of these terms that continues to chase after its own definition and gets larger and larger, especially recently, as you say. You would talk about bioethics in the earlier days, almost entirely connected to biomedical ethics. And those issues that go back as long as we can imagine how individuals made decisions around health and death and dying and birth, and how tribes even make those decisions, all the way to today and beyond, where we see that it's surprising that much of what we're talking about bioethics has to do with things things we call organisms that not too many decades ago we weren't even sure were life. So it continues, the technology, and I use that broadly, I don't mean nuts and bolts technology, but broader technology, I understand, continues to expand it, almost to the point where you can't say that bioethics is your interest or your field unless you subdivide it now as a medical ethicist or perhaps as an environmental bioethicist, et cetera.
So maybe we'll talk a little bit about synthetic biology, since that is the Commission's charge right now from the President to do a report on synthetic biology, or SynBio. Mm-hmm. Maybe you'll tell us about what is SynBio, but in doing so, we want to remind everybody that the Presidents are not speaking for the Commission. They are only speaking for themselves. The Commission is now developing a report. There was a couple-of-day meeting here. The report will be out in December, January?
Should be out in a few weeks' time.
And then you'll be able to see the Commission's work, but you can also see it on the web. But tell us a little bit about how the Commission is approaching the topic of synthetic biology.
The Commission is tried to contain the definition a little bit. If I just asked you what is synthetic biology, you might simply take the concatenation of those two words and imagine that it could be anything that has to do with the producing of new elements, synthesizing new living elements. It might be, you might throw tissue engineering into that category. But what the Commission has done is chosen to focus on what really is the working definition in literature now, range of definitions in literature now, that has to do with sort of a quantum advancement in our ability to do genetic engineering. And what that means for a new, it might not be far from the truth to imagine that if last century was a century focused on technologies of transportation, communication, computing, synthetic materials, that we are in a century that might be called, someday in retrospect, the biocentury. Because you can imagine the manufacture of organisms now that are micro-factories, producing vaccines, producing new materials and new structures, any of these things, and by the way, it's important for me anyway to make the distinction that it's not entirely medical. I think as an engineer and with some experience in material science and engineering, it's always been horribly frustrating to ceramic engineers. Ceramic engineers, of course, are the ones that take the ceramic chemicals, the chemicals necessary to make ceramics, and fashion them and mold them and then fire them at extremely high temperatures to do exactly what clams do by the thousands and thousands of tons every day. And so understanding, understanding those processes, I think also and the degree to which we would engineer organisms, and particularly through their DNA, in order to provide these kinds of functions and utilities, to do them predictably and reliably. And of course, the Commission is very concerned about doing it safely and in ways that don't contribute to insecurity, to security issues.
So let me give you two examples of what is now happening in the synthetic biology community that might give you some sense of where this field may be heading. One is a set of experiments that are quite far along, headed by a scientist named Jay Kiesling, who's now on the West Coast, developing a semi-synthetic antimalarial drug. It's based on a natural product called artemisinin. Artemisinin.
It's easy for you to say.
Yes, right. I practiced that word. And
it's hard.
Because it's a natural product, it's very scarce, or it's scarce. All natural products tend to be scarce. And by synthesizing part of this product, Kiesling's group has been able to potentially develop an antimalarial drug that will be much easier to produce, will be very consistent and predictable in its production, and has the capacity potentially, and I mean potentially in a few years from now. It's already been bought by a drug company and it's already in the stages of production. It has the potential for saving 700,000 to 1 million lives per year of people who die from malaria. Another example is what the J. Craig Venter Institute is working on. One of the things they're working on is environmentally friendly biofuels. And here, what they're doing is basically manipulating a genome and figuring out what's essential for the genome to replicate and live. And they're able to inject a genome of one species into a bacterial cell of another species, and the injected genome is self-replicating and takes over the cell. And that is also raises the possibility of taking algae, very simple organisms, and manipulating them in a way that they can create bio-friendly fuels.
So the connection between the philosophy and the engineering is part of what bioethics is in the 21st century and part of the biocentury.
Go for it.
Yeah.
They both have something to say about this.
Yes. I think part of what our universities have been pushing really hard and successfully is the interdisciplinary nature of the most important knowledge that's been produced in this, and that's going to be produced in this century. I call it the integration of knowledge. I call it the integration of knowledge because you really need to integrate an understanding of science and engineering, and that in itself is interdisciplinary to know engineering, biology, chemistry, physics, with an understanding of ethics and practical ethics in order to be able to move forward in this regard. It's to Venter's credit that he enlisted a group of ethicists to talk about what the potential risks here are and whether you should put suicide genes into a new organism so that if it's released into the environment and it turns out to be very aggressive in the environment, you could kill you'd have the potential to kill the new organism before it took over in a way that you wouldn't want it to take over. And I give you this scenario because it was the most vivid scenario that we had when the commission met at Penn. One of the scientists talked about this scenario. It may actually have been, or maybe it was Jonathan himself who testified, and talked about, this is a futuristic scenario. It's not, I don't want any of you to get scared at the moment because nobody can do it right now, but you put a new organism into the environment and it turns out that it starts, maybe it's something, a new organism that you want to have in your clothing, and before you know it, it's melting things down, it's going into your driveway and melting down your car, and so on. And the vision it gave me was, I'm a big film buff, of the only film in my lifetime I ever walked out of because it terrified me, and it was called The Blob. Mm-hmm. And this is one of those scenarios that people are scared about. But it goes back to Jonathan's question, which is the nature of bioethics now requires you to understand science as well as you understand ethics, and vice versa.
President Wagner?
You covered that very, very well. You gave me a softball because you didn't use just science. You said and engineering in yours. And as you can imagine from my comments earlier, I've spent a good deal of time trying to rationalize how I contribute to this, this committee. And in fact, this business of translation of knowledge and also the structure of a process to make sure we advance responsibly in synthetic biology is something that I do think we can use some of the templates that come from engineering. First of all, engineers imagine themselves as creative scientists. You don't often think of that. You think of them less basic and more applied, but I suggest to you that you would be, except for the paneling in this room, hard-pressed to look around and find anything that actually exists in nature that wasn't somehow engineered and produced. But the bigger contribution, I think, that we will learn and we are bringing from the engineering disciplines to help us address the issue is the notion that Amy refers to about being interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary. I've challenged audiences in the past, to put your mental hand up. Don't raise your hand, but if you would like to volunteer the name of your favorite engineer, in general, very few hands go up. And yet, you would say that some of the most important achievements that you can think of, landing on the moon, well, of course, Al Gore did the internet, but others, it's very hard to pin an engineer's name to that. And part of the reason is the recognition of the value of teamwork, if you will. Working with people that bring different expertise, different levels of expertise in different areas together and harvesting what is the best out of them. I'll share with you that that's also what makes engineers geeks. Yes, the geekness comes from recognizing that I can be valued for just the little thing that I bring to the table, so long as I do that well, and I may be less of a well-rounded person. But that's our little secret. The bigger point to take away from this is that after having a century of what I think is marvelous engineering advancement, adding to the constraints and also, adding to the materials, in this case biological materials, and important constraints, ethical constraints, the models that have served us so well in the past century, I think we can put together, and we will put to wonderful use in the new century, related to bioethics broadly, but synthetic biology in particular. Yeah.
So I think Professor Kinlaw has a couple of her own questions, and I have one or two more for you, and then we'll take some of the questions that we got from the group.
Good.
Great, very good. So you've begun talking already a bit about the ways in which I think Penn and Emory may be particularly well situated to address some of these questions. Would you talk a little bit more about that, and also talk about the ways in which our universities can actually foster ethical behavior and encourage ethics education and research?
Well, both of our institutions are research-intensive institutions. These are institutions that ask the why questions and know how to ask the why questions. The pressures of the time, interests of the time, have helped us to guide and rein in, to some degree, our eagerness simply to get to the scientific answer, to get to the engineering solution. And on our respective campuses, there is guiding some of our advancement this commitment to ethical behavior and to continuing to define that ethical behavior. As I mentioned in opening remarks, Emory has been so bold over the years to be very explicit about that. And so it is quite possible, not quite possible, it happens even in our boardroom, where someone will say, this looks like a wonderful idea, a great opportunity for Emory, and then someone will say, well, is it right? You should be proud of that. And I know the same things are happening at our best institutions around the country. About how to teach it, I have some biases on that. I don't think it's necessarily the case that explicit courses in ethics have been uniformly successful. I think that to some of our students it's been no more than a box to be checked off as one marches toward 120 credit hours or whatever it takes to graduate. But we are seeing, owing again to this appetite for interdisciplinary activity, we are seeing opportunities to integrate ethics into the curriculum in existing courses. Many universities have for a long time, for their undergraduate curriculum, designated courses as writing-intensive courses, right? If you take comparative literature and you're required to write so many essays, you get a little W, and you need so many W's on your transcript. One might imagine, what would it mean if across our nation, at least within our institutions we're talking about, Penn and Emory, there were E-courses, where the biologist, when talking about genetics, the biology professor would have the opportunity, the excuse, if you will, the authority to introduce into the classroom and onto examinations what are some of the ethics considerations. And you can find ethical considerations in all of the sciences, physics and natural sciences, and you can certainly find them in history and in our literature, in classics. I would advocate, as you know, on our campus, I'm advocating that we look at ways to integrate these sorts of things into the courses, into the experiences that we already have. One final thing that Emory enjoys is a reputation for defending the role of universities as forum, a place, there need to be places, again, I'll ask you to raise your mental hand and raise the number of fingers of places that exist in the world where you believe that people with violently opposed views can be invited, in fact insisted on coming together to engage nonviolently. And I don't think you come up with more than one finger, because I think we wish it were true in our houses of worship and in the halls of Congress. It is only true, it seems to me, it's principally true, let me put it that way, on our university campuses, and not all of those, I'm afraid. And so we find the obligation in true liberal learning with a lowercase l to be sure that we represent conservative and liberal views, that we have room for people to speak from Palestine and Israel, from Tibet and from China, etc. So this forum component, I think, makes our universities, and again, a great reputation at Penn for doing exactly those same things as well.
Yeah, I think it's really critical that universities have a commitment to ethics education throughout the curriculum and not just in one place, segregated. As it once was. It once was everybody. In fact, at the beginning of universities, colleges and universities, it was often the president who taught the required ethics course.
True.
And it was generally a course in religious ethics, and not religious ethics generally, but in one religion's ethics. And then it became, that was rejected as universities became more diverse. And it was relegated to philosophy departments, which would teach ethics, and that became more and more theoretical ethics. Now, places like Emory and Penn, the enlightened universities of the world, have interdisciplinary ethics centers. John Marino and Art Kaplan are very important prime movers in Penn's Bioethics Center. It unites our School of Medicine, Arts and Sciences, Wharton Law, many of our 12 schools. And as importantly, and this is just one example, but it's an important example, undergraduates and graduate and professional students alike get educated by our Bioethics Center. And Penn undergraduates have started a premier undergraduate journal in bioethics, which if you read it, you wouldn't know it was written by undergraduates. It is really just phenomenally informative. And why is that important for those people who are already graduated from universities? Because there is barely an aspect of our lives today that isn't affected by bioethics. Let me give you an example as recently as last year. When the swine flu broke out, there was a big question of the production of the swine flu vaccine, and then even if it had been able to be produced more quickly, as synthetic biology might help happen in the future, there's a big question of its distribution. Who gets it first? At how much cost? Who bears the cost of it? What are the best incentives out there for the experimentation that has to be done when you experiment on human subjects? What do you owe them after the experiments are done? Can you just pick up and leave and sell it on the market and say, you know, we did our jobs with you? And then the question, all of these questions are questions that universities, if we don't ask them and try to come up with really good answers, even if they're not universally accepted answers, but well-reasoned answers, I submit to you, nobody else is going to do it.
Exactly. You know, one of the things we have in common also, particularly for undergraduates, is the commitment to being a residential campus. You know, there's a little snicker that went through the audience when we said the enlightened universities. Well, maybe there are some enlightened and some not enlightened, but there's sure some...
It was pride, right?
That's right. But there's sure some that are able and not able. The commitment to the residential campus, where we are doing more than just housing students, but we're having them involved in a community that starts a journal on bioethics. My goodness, I wasn't aware of that, and that's wonderful. But the commitment to living in community and imagining that, at least in the bubbles of our campuses, we can advance the values of what it means to be in community just a smidgen higher even than the rest of society. Then we graduate people into society who make that difference. So we have this idealism that shame on us if we do not take advantage of it to address very explicitly or to take advantage very explicitly of these opportunities to show the applications of ethical behavior and thought.
Absolutely.
And I find as a professor in several departments that the demand for interdisciplinarity and knowledge integration comes from the students in the 21st century. One of the really healthy things at campuses like Emory and Penn, my students, undergrads, grad students, are not satisfied if they ask me a question and I say, gee, that's not my department.
Yeah.
You know,
Yes.
well, you know, isn't this important, the thing we were talking about today in the lecture? How come you don't know something about it? Right? So thank God there's Wikipedia, so that saves me. I shouldn't have mentioned that, probably. So one last question before we turn to some questions from the audience, and we have to say that we're sorry we couldn't get to every one of them, but there are a few that we will be addressing. What you've heard from the presidents tonight, many of you have probably heard them before at other events, but what strikes me is that you are knowledge integrators. I mean, as much as you know about what you've talked about ethics tonight and science and so forth, you do this almost every night. So what are the values and skills that a president has to bring? And by the way, some of my best friends are college university presidents, and the job seems impossible. I'm glad you're doing this. What are the skills and values that, as presidents, you, in specific, bring to being leaders of a presidential ethics commission, which could not be a more sensitive or more public role for an academic leader?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So let me begin just by saying that Jim and I also have the pleasure of leading a commission that has 11 other academics on it who also model the integration of knowledge and come from institutions across the United States that are really quite exemplary in this regard. And one of the takeaways from this evening for all of us, I think, it's certainly from Jim and my own experience on the commission, is how far universities have come in demonstrating the importance of interdisciplinarity. It's a very long word, but it's the I think it's easier to wrap one's mind around the integration of knowledge, and how committed how important it is to be committed to showing what knowledge can do for one society in the world. And that gets me to directly answering Jonathan's question, which is, I'm a firm believer in the view that universities don't come into the world with a right to exist. People have a right to exist. Universities have to prove themselves in society. We have to show day in and day out what value we add in the education we give our students, in the difference we make in the lives of our alumni, and in the difference we make in the ability of our societies to prosper, not only economically, but culturally and ethically. And that gets me to what presidents have to do. We have, I think, some of the best jobs in the world, but they're only good if you really have the willingness and the ability to bring a lot of very smart people together and figure out how you can get them to collaborate with one another, right? And you've heard all the metaphors of, herding cats and so on. But what I believe day in and day out, and I live day in and day out, and Jim does too, and I think one of the reasons we're both, I'll speak for myself, I'm so thrilled to have Jim as a partner in this commission, is we really believe that we are stronger as individuals and our institutions are stronger as institutions to the extent that we can attract an incredible diversity of really smart people who are not only really smart and really diverse, because that isn't enough, but we can encourage them to want to work together and to produce something, whatever it is, that is bigger and better than any of them can do by themselves. And that's the same thing I feel as a leader of Penn. What I've been able to accomplish, whatever it is has to be greater than the sum of all the parts of Penn. And Penn has an incredible number of parts. It's got 12 different schools. It's got 290,000 at our last count living alumni. It's, we're a very important anchor institution in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, and so on and so forth. But what that means is the same skills and the same kinds of actions that I need to take to move Penn forward, I think helps us on the presidential commission and helps me get along with an engineer.
Which is a big challenge, a big challenge. Yeah, amen to all of that. I think it's interesting, though, don't you, Amy, that this is a relatively new phenomenon. That is, inviting university presidents into this form of leadership. Historically, when the nation has wanted to assemble a task force or a commission to examine its science policy and its science future, surprisingly, it's rare that they have invited, NASA's redirection recently. Norm Augustine was asked to chair that, and yet, arguably, NASA is the biggest science left dollar-wise, or was the biggest science left dollar-wise here. It's a relatively new phenomenon also historically, right? Remember, universities are roots. The reason we still put on those silly robes and hats goes back to our monastic roots, where we felt it best to isolate ourselves from society. It's still the case that some of our most wonderful liberal arts, small liberal arts institutions are in little burgs separated in the northeast of the country somewhere. But it's shouldn't have said that. Should I said little burgs. But the notion that universities should be engaged as opposed to be isolated is relatively new in the history of a very old institution, 1,000-year-old institution, right? But the notion that we should be engaged, first of all, is relatively new, and secondly, to invite presidents, a huge feather in your cap, it seems to me, and I appreciate you bringing me along, that science policy for the future of our country, and to the extent that our country leads the science for much of the world, for the future of the world, is quite a responsibility, and we do indeed hope that many of the skills that are applied to the leadership of a university serve well also in this leadership function.
Well, it's clear that command and control is no longer in the corporate sector, the desired mode of leadership. And it's a necessity in university leadership to be able to get people to willingly collaborate. And you have to inspire them to do that. But inspiration alone is not going to be enough either. We should we would love to get a question or two in. Some of the questions, yes.
This is a rather long one, so bear with me. What role or how strong a position should universities take regarding bioethics debates in the 21st century? Should universities take a position, maybe a partisan position, or should they be more even-handed in approaching opposing positions? I believe I've read that correctly.
You want to start? Or
Sure.
you want me to do that?
So that's a really good question because it's a hard question. There's not a simple answer to it. So let me try to give a clear answer to it, even if not simple. Universities are consummately nonpartisan institutions. And one of the wonderful features of the Presidential Commission is it was created to be a nonpartisan commission. We welcome scholars who are experts in their field, and we have no litmus test for their political views. So to the extent that there are partisan positions in the area of bioethics, we don't take them. However, neither do we practice what is an increasingly common practice in journalism, which is for every issue, there's, you find two experts, or at least I'll put experts in quotes, one of whom has position A, and the other one who has position not A, and you give equal time to A and not A, no matter whether all the evidence is on one side or the other. So we are dedicated to well-reasoned argument and to gathering facts and evidence and following them where they may lead. Now, what does that mean in the case of bioethics? In most issues of bioethics, we don't, as universities, take a position as presidents. However, we do practice some positions in bioethics. Let me just give you the one that probably brought bioethics into its adulthood, and that is informed consent among individuals who are asked to participate in any kind of medical practice. We take a position on that. We're in favor of informed consent. And there are many other practices that have been well argued and established in bioethics in which we as university presidents take very clear positions by how we run our institutions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this question about taking a strong position. One of the wonderful things that I think a university community does is not necessarily accept that there are two points of view on anything. The image came today in one of our discussions when we were talking about the scale of weighing A versus B. If I were an artist, and maybe I should commission someone, I'd love them to draw for me a device that was a scale with a dozen pans all around. One of the things that universities are able to do, and we must do when somebody comes to us and says, what is your position on this, that, or the other? By the way, I'll have to make a comment on how the press manages us. You'll identify with that. But what is your position? Is it A or B? And we need to be careful to make sure we have also asked about C, D, E, and F. I think the relative proportion, and we should, we're university folks, we should be able to introduce lightning rod topics. But I think some of the discussion around the lightning rod topic of stem cell use needs to be understood and weighed from the perspective of the sources of stem cells, the ultimate uses. Are they to be used in research only, or do we really imagine using them in embryonic stem cells in ongoing therapies, in which case we would necessarily need to have factories producing, factories I use in cynical quotes, to produce a constant flow of high volume of embryonic stem cells. The point I'm trying to get at is the university is not, it's not that we are necessarily aggravatingly neutral. It's that we must be inclusive. That's the working definition on a university campus of diversity. It's not about tolerating different people with different backgrounds and different views and different races. It's about demanding that we have people who authentically represent as many different perspectives as possible in order that we can, with integrity, say that we have studied and understand and then ultimately can offer an opinion on a subject. Universities are very well positioned to do this, and at the end of the day, as Amy says, we can offer opinions. I will tell you,
Blessedly, it's not always the president who has to offer the opinion.
Absolutely.
We have lots of other voices.
In fact, and that's why I use the we, but it's all the time that a reporter calls and says, where do you stand on the war in Afghanistan? And where do you stand on this, that, and the other? And I have to say, you really are, I'm so flattered you're interested in where Jim Wagner stands on the war of Afghanistan. And she says, what do you mean by that? And I said, well, will your headline say that Jim thinks this, or is it that the president of Emory University thinks this? And very quickly they understand that they're not going to get an answer on that because it wouldn't be appropriate. One of the reasons that we get the big bucks is to suppress, very frankly, no, I'm not going to take it. The bait was too good, almost too good. But it really is, part of what we are paid for is to sublimate our egos and opinions to the mission of the institution. And so you're very right. It's blessedly seldom the case that...
I think one of the reasons university presidents, in this case, were asked to lead the presidential commission is we're very practiced in knowing when to take positions, and it's as important when you take them as what you take, because we and the commission are hearing the widest range of viewpoints on synthetic biology before we come to our decision as to what to advise in the report. Deliberation is about arguing and discussing, but also deciding. It's different than just discussing. And we hear the widest range of viewpoints before we actually issue our opinion. When we do issue our opinion, as Jim suggested, there is almost no arena for which a university president can issue an opinion as Amy Gutman or Jim Wagner, as opposed to the president of Penn and Emory. Yeah.
Do we have time for one more?
Well, let's do a couple.
Right.
We can be short.
So moving us back.
Why don't you give us a lightning round? We'll be really quick.
All right, lightning round number one. I'm moving us back to the work of the commission a bit in this question, so you might reflect on the role of the commission here. How can we best protect vulnerable members of our society in the work of the commission?
First of all, and I'll be lightning quick on this, it's a very important issue, we have to consider how new technologies and science affect the most vulnerable populations. And I think we have to begin there and make sure we don't have a disproportionate distribution of either benefits or harms only to the most advantaged. And if we don't pay attention to that, it won't happen, because the vulnerable are, in a sense, the invisible in our society, and you can judge a society by how it treats its vulnerable. And on that count, we could do better.
And the only thing I would add is Amy has been using in the Commission a wonderful definition for stewardship. And it includes the notion that stewardship is the responsibility for us to, the responsibility we must take for those who do not have voice. That includes, that includes those without privilege, but it also includes subsequent generations that haven't yet been given voice. So I would add that to your point.
Okay, lightning round 2. How do you feel about the patenting of genes?
Sometimes yes and sometimes no.
Do you want to go or you want me to go on that?
That's my...
I think I'm of mixed mind on that, and I think it's one of the things we need to study to the extent that genes are essentially information at this point. How do I feel about the restriction of information under the laws of our current patent code? Not very good. On the other hand, to have to suppress or restrict the opportunity for genetic knowledge to come to further fruition commercially because we have not protected it in some way is a concern. So that's a non-answer to say that I think I'm aware of both issues, but those are the concerns.
No, it is not a question you can answer briefly, because we don't want genes per se to be exclusive property if they're not going to be used in beneficial ways. On the other hand, you have to have incentives to develop new medical treatments, new technologies, and so this is one where the devil and God are both in the details.
2 more questions. Another fairly specific one, and then a broad one before we end. Are there bioethical issues involved in introducing emergency obstetrical and neonatal care services in low-resource countries?
Yes, definitely. And let me just give, because it's a very specific question, but let me just give you a very quick case study, Haiti. There were doctors who went down there, and there were emergency conditions. There was no infrastructure, as any of you would recognize it, no sterilization capacities. People were suffering terribly, and the whole issue of triage medicine comes to the fore. And there, you need a prior ethics education in this, which is what happens in our universities, to be able to even begin to think about how you're going to deal with a situation like that. Very scarce resources, extremely high human need. It is the case where tragic choices often have to be made, whether you like it or not. And then the question is, what are the best ways of making those choices?
We've had so many false starts in that area of working with peoples of developing nations. As you know, Kathy, Emory, through its affiliation with the CDC and the Carter Center and CARE, that's headquartered in Atlanta, does a great deal of work in developing nations. Education is the key, and everybody nods, until I go on further and say, we need to be educated. It turns out understanding how ethics play out in these environments, particularly around offering health care, is sometimes counterintuitive. Emory was part of a program, as many places were in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, of educating nurses, which you would think on the face of it would be a wonderful thing, until you realize that when we were successful in doing so, these people were wonderfully marketable and were gobbled up in South Asia and Europe. And we actually contributed to brain drain. And the current projects happening in our nursing school now are to train healthcare workers tuned for and prepared for the particular challenges in that area, it makes them marvelously marketable right there where they are, and useful without having this other unanticipated impact. So I guess when I'm shorthand note, yes, there are ethical issues, and it's often the case that we are not aware enough of the facts until we go in there and study the circumstances.
The President's Commission is going to be given, as part of its next charge, to look at the standards by which international clinical trials should be conducted. And that will be a very challenging charge for us. And we will put together, once this charge comes forward by the President, we will undoubtedly have to put together an international working group to deliberate.
Last question before turning it over to Dr. Marino. So today, and many of you all were a part of the Presidential Commission hearings, we watched the issuance of some draft recommendations and some very exciting recommendations. And some of the questions that were raised had to do with, and where do we go from here, and who is the report for? So this question is, how do we ensure that the Commission reports are not just left on the shelf, as Hugh Whitall from the Newfield Council said?
You should go on that one.
We are an advisory commission, so the strength and power of our report will lie in the strength and power of the recommendations, coupled with how clearly we express them. And so we are not only deliberating about the recommendations, which we previewed in the last 2 days here at Emory, but we're also really working to make this report accessible to the general educated public. Now, we also have the great advantage that the President asked us to advise him and the federal agencies involved. We do have the power to address advice to those agencies, and they have been extraordinarily cooperative and are eager to hear our advice. I don't know how eager they'll be to carry it out. But I think having the President behind us in a nonpartisan set of advisory recommendations can't hurt. Yeah.
What you said, that's right.
Well, like Chris Matthews, who got a famous thrill up his leg, when I was asked to moderate with 2 presidents and Professor Kinlaw, I kind of got a thrill too. I said, I'm going to be able to tell 2 presidents of great universities when they have to stop talking. So tenure is a good thing.
Notice he didn't ask whether we thought tenure was a good thing.
We'll have that discussion later on. But I do want to bring it back. Well, a last thought, to bring it back to what President Wagner said in the beginning, referring to a noted humanist who seemed to think we should go back to the isolated cap and gown days in the monastery. I remember when I was about 10 years old reading a comic book. I was a big comic book reader and occasionally will indulge. Classics Illustrated. I'm showing my age here. Remember those? The Classics Illustrated version of The Life and Death of Socrates, which I'm sure made me decide to become a philosopher. And I remember that Socrates was followed by a bunch of people, the ages of our students, into the marketplace, into the agora, and he challenged the wise men, not the women apparently, except perhaps in one case. I think that suggests that ethics has a place in the agora, did in the beginning and continues to, and perhaps even more important now. I myself have to say that I would prefer not to drink the hemlock, so my students make me a little nervous sometimes when they challenge me, but that's what we do at places like Penn and Emory. We kind of put ourselves on the line as professors and encourage our students to challenge us. And that's what keeps us sharp, and we hope keeps us sharp for a while longer. And thanks to the presidents for keeping us on track, and Professor Kinlaw. I have the pleasure now of introducing the Emory a cappella group, the men's a cappella group,
I didn't know that.
Who will sing No Strings Attached, they're called, who will sing the alma maters. First the Penn alma mater, and then the Emory alma mater.
Fabulous.
So welcome,
How about that?
gentlemen.
Hey, gentlemen. Good to see you.
Could we have everyone please rise for the singing of the anthem and the alma mater? Thank you.
Move over here.
Come all ye loyal classmen now in hall and campus through. Lift up your hearts and voices for the royal red and blue. Fair Harvard has her crimson, old Yale her colors too. But for dear Pennsylvania, we wear the red and blue. Hurrah, hurrah, Pennsylvania, hurrah for the red and the blue. Hurrah, 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 hurrah for the red and blue.
Whoa.
In the heart of dear old Emory, where the sun doth shine, that is where our hearts are turning round old Emory shrine. We will ever sing thy praises, sons and daughters true. Hail we now our alma mater, hail the gold and blue. Though the years around us gather, crowned with love and cheer, till the memory of old Emory grows to us more dear. We will ever sing thy praises, sons and daughters true. Hail we now our alma mater, hail the gold and blue. We will ever sing thy praises, and daughters true. Hail we now our alma mater, hail the gold and blue.
A little bit of stylistic liberty there.
Great, awesome. Even if we didn't get equal time, you were great.
Thanks a lot.
Great.
You mastered this as
Very
well.
good.
Thank you.
Congratulations. Thank you. Good to meet you.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Well done.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you all.
Wonderful.
Yeah, hey.
We done good. That's great. Oh, you want some photos?
Wait.
Yeah, let me get rid of this thing.